Alpat, I'll begin with you. Well, taking a leaf out of what Tom also said, that, besides all, the topics or the agendas that the UNGA lets you address, there is a big question mark, a silent question mark, perhaps I can say, sir, over the functioning of the United Nations itself. India needs a bigger chunk out of this representation, being the fourth largest economy now and the most populated country in the world as well. It needs more representation in what it says and what it feels. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, Minister Jaishankar is a very able person when it comes to presenting India's case, and I'm sure he's going to present it very diplomatically, but also very strongly. I quite agree with you that the UN is very badly in need of reform. The UN Security Council, for example, I mean, it's usually a deadlock council. I can't, you'd have to go back a long time before you can think of any international conflict or international problem that was resolved by the UNSC because it's so hopelessly divided. And India not being there makes no sense at all. The origin of that was because Winston Churchill, when the United Nations was founded, he said India should not be there. China, of course, the United States wanted China. That was actually KMT China. Chiang Kai-shek's China. And Nixon and Kissinger made the concession of allowing China to take the place of Taiwan, whereas actually it is KMT, the ruling China, that was ensuring that the space that the seat was given. So from all points of view, Churchill did not want India. Very frankly, he didn't want China either. But Roosevelt insisted on, and the Americans insisted on China, whereas in the case of India, unfortunately, Churchill was very strong and insistent that no, it should go to France. Now, France has been under German occupation for much of the war. And if you look at the number of soldiers, Indian soldiers were about 2.5 million in that Second World War. But despite that, they did not get representation at the UNSC. Instead, China got it, France got it. And today, you have these countries, France, China, US, Russia, Britain. And if you look at the GDP, for example, of Britain and France and Russia, in fact, it is much below that of India. So India is a very strong case. I'm sure Minister Jaishankar will be very diplomatic, as I said, but he will argue very clearly on the need for UN reforms. Otherwise, the UN is looking like a body which has frankly outlived its use. And, our correspondent also made the same remark. People are looking up at it and they're saying, what is this huge white elephant? The United Nations. So I think it's badly need a reform. Secondly, I think, Minister Jaishankar is not going to present issues in like global north versus global south or matters like that. Of course not. The north and the south need to work in many areas seamlessly together. And India has always shown the way in that kind of a seamless working, uh, along with its strong championing of the global south. So I think the international priorities of India, the international priorities of global south, the international priorities of democracies will all be stressed by Minister Jaishankar, and what is going to be an extremely important address to the UN General Assembly, and one that should go in the records as one of the best speeches made in the UNGA in the recent past. Thank you, Vineet.
Absolutely right, sir. Ambassador Sachdev, how do you weigh in on this important address that the External Affairs Minister is going to give? India finds itself on the anvil of a number of challenges, a lot of them being brought upon us by the host country.
That's true. Thank you, Vineet, for having me. And I agree with Professor Nalpat that this session, the 80th session of United Nations Annual General Assembly is very important and ought to lead to redefinition of a lot of priorities and directions. But this is more to hope than to expect. Now, India is faced with tremendous challenges thrown in by the international community, the developments from Ukraine to Gaza. We have tried to pivot ourselves very carefully, but yet we have got ourselves into difficulties, primarily due to the United States President Trump being too aggressive about certain core interests that we have. Trade with United States is our largest. Similarly, the IT sector's uh, dependence on the United States market has also been come under harsh spotlight with $100,000 incremental visa fee being imposed last week. So all these are signs of stress, and India needs as many friends as we can get. And this is the primary, uh, if I can say so, objective of the UNGA session presence by our External Affairs Minister, meeting people, convincing them of India's righteousness, and creating a coalition of like-minded countries, south as well as in north. And I think this is where he has been very active. The UNGA speech would obviously be important, but it's not going to convert any minds afresh. Uh, People speak at UNGA annual session for the record and for ascribing blame on their opponents, etc., etc. But uh, in the end, everybody goes home and life goes on as it is. So, what is important is to state our position rhetorically or otherwise as to what do we expect today's world to be directed towards. International community, international organizations reforms are a priority. WTO is dysfunctional, for example. UNESCO is dying. Human Rights Commission has been deprived of various fundings, etc., etc. So all these crises, along with the United Nations' own larger dysfunctionality, would be highlighted, I imagine. But then there are contradictory versions. President Trump also lampoons United Nations, but from the other end, because it does not support his position, particularly in support of Israel and in support of his position on Russia, Ukraine crisis.
Right, sir.
He's angry at United Nations for other reasons than we are angry at United Nations for. So there has to be a meeting of the mind. The place requires restructuring. All of us are of the same opinion that it has outlived its utility, but what replaces it and what direction does it take is important. Otherwise, we are headed the same way as League of Nations was headed 100 years ago. Thank you.
Professor Nalapat, taking a leaf out of what Ambassador Sachdev also said, that it's an idea to have to actually go about recommending that the UN is defunct to a certain point to a certain extent, but it's a different aspect and a thing altogether to come up with a workable solution. In your vast experience and profound knowledge, what is the alternative?
Look, quite frankly, there is no alternative in sight. Now, as has correctly been said by Ambassador Sachdev, the League of Nations was a failure. It failed to prevent a world war, and frankly, so far the United Nations, we have not faced a world war on the scale of World War One and World War Two, but we are very close to it in terms of tensions in various places. Now, instead of war, a single war covering a large area, we are looking at multiple wars, and these wars have sprung up in so many locations, and they seem intractable. Ukraine, for example, it's a terrible situation where it is fighting Russia, and with the help of NATO. And of course, the US is very happy because the US is selling weapons to the European countries who are giving them to Ukraine. So, very frankly, the US is profiting very handsomely from a continuation of this conflict. Look at what's happening in Gaza. I don't see a resolution of that in the Palestinian issue because the most important countries to resolve it, apart from, of course, the Palestinians themselves, are Israel and the United States. And neither of them have signed on the way France and Britain and Germany and Australia and so many other countries in the West have signed on to, essentially calling for an immediate ceasefire. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen until the military wing of Hamas is completely dismantled. The Israelis are going to go ahead because that October 7 attack brought back terrible memories of the Holocaust, which took place under Adolf Hitler. And the Jewish community as a global community is very clear. They will not allow another Holocaust. In that context, we have to view this Gaza situation. And I think Hamas, frankly, committed a huge error, as it must have realized, as people around it will realize, by going after Israel, which frankly did nothing against Hamas. And that, I think, was a problem. Netanyahu should have done something, but he did nothing. But the reality is that none of these conflicts is going away, and they're not going to go away because there is and I also listened to President Trump's speech. It was the whole thing was a litany of attack on the United Nations and the UN system and on different countries. But the reality is that, how does one resolve these issues? So far as India is concerned, in my personal view, I think any institution, so it's a UN Security Council, for example, supposed to represent international opinion and does not have the most populous country in the world, is frankly cannot be called representative of global opinion. So I'd like to again say, Vineet, I think Minister Jaishankar is going to point to the inequity of keeping India out,
All right,
that
sir.
old Churchill sin, and he's going to point to the need for greater equity in terms of relationships, North and South, and various other, types of relationships. And I think he'll also stress on India's legacy of fighting against terrorism. And that's a very, very important motive, in my view, for Minister Jaishankar's speech. Thank you, Vinny.
Fair enough, sir. Professor Nalapattam Sachdev, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.